3 years ago, I made the mistake of driving the entire length of the Blue Ridge Parkway alone during late October. At the time, I was 31 years old and working as a freelance photographer based out of Nashville. I specialized in landscape photography, especially abandoned places and remote wilderness areas. That fall, I had been hired to create a photo series covering isolated mountain communities throughout Western Virginia. I thought it would be peaceful. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The Blue Ridge Parkway feels different once the sun starts going down. During the day, it is beautiful. Endless forests painted orange and red, old mountains rolling beneath layers of fog, quiet little overlooks where tourists stop to take pictures. But at night, those mountains feel ancient, not old, ancient, like something in them has been watching people long before roads were ever carved through the hills. I had spent most of the afternoon taking photos near an isolated overlook about 40 miles north of Roanoke. By the time I packed my gear, heavy fog had started moving through the valleys below. That was when I realized my car would not start. At first, I assumed the battery was dead, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. No clicking, no lights, completely dead. And of course, I had no phone signal. I remember standing there in the cold wind, staring at the empty road, thinking how strange it was that I had not seen another car in almost an hour. Then I heard someone whistle behind me. I turned and saw an older man standing near the tree line. I still do not know how long he had been watching me. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing muddy work boots, a brown hunting jacket, and a faded camouflage cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered like old leather, and he carried a flashlight, even though there was still some daylight left. "You broke down?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I told him my battery was dead and asked if there was a ranger station nearby. He smiled a little and said, "No ranger stations out here. Closest help's about 20 miles south." Then he introduced himself as Earl. Earl said he lived nearby, up in the holler with his nephews, and offered to help tow my car after dark once they brought their truck. Something about him immediately made me uneasy. Not because he looked threatening, because he looked completely unsurprised to find me stranded there, like he had expected someone to eventually stop. Still, I did not have many options. The temperature was dropping fast, and the fog was getting thicker every minute. Earl told me there was an old service cabin nearby where I could stay warm until his nephews arrived. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We walked off the roadside and into the woods. At first, there actually was a visible trail, narrow, overgrown, probably used by maintenance workers years ago. But after 15 minutes, the trail disappeared completely. I asked Earl if we were close. He did not answer right away. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Folks from the city always think these mountains are empty." The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just our footsteps crunching across dead leaves. Then I noticed lights moving through the trees ahead of us. Flashlights, at least 3 of them. Earl stopped walking and smiled without looking back at me. Told my boys to come meet us. Every survival instinct in my body started screaming. I immediately told him I wanted to go back to the road. Earl slowly turned around, and for the first time, the friendly expression disappeared from his face completely. "You ain't gonna find that road again by yourself," he said quietly. That was the moment I knew I was in real danger. I backed away slowly, while the lights ahead kept getting closer between the trees. Then, somewhere off to my right, I heard another whistle answer from the darkness. They had surrounded me. I dropped my camera bag and ran. Branches tore across my face as I sprinted blindly downhill through the forest. Behind me, I could hear shouting and heavy footsteps crashing through the woods. But the worst part was how calm they sounded. Nobody was yelling in panic. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded practiced, like this was something they had done before. I fell twice running down the mountain. The second time, I slammed into a creek bed, hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs. That probably saved my life, because while I was lying there trying to breathe, I noticed something through the trees below me. Headlights, a road. I scrambled downhill toward it as fast as I could, while the flashlight beams behind me bounced closer through the woods. When I burst out onto the pavement, I nearly got hit by a passing pickup truck. The driver stopped immediately after seeing the state I was in, covered in mud, bleeding from my hands, barely able to talk. He drove me straight to the sheriff's office in a nearby mountain town. When I described Earl to the deputy, his expression changed instantly. He asked me one question. Did he mention family living in the hollers? I said yes. The deputy leaned back in his chair and went completely quiet for a few seconds. Then he told me there had been multiple disappearances along isolated sections of the parkway over the last decade. Mostly travelers, mostly people alone. A few abandoned vehicles had been recovered, but the people were never found. According to locals, there were families deep in those mountains who avoided outsiders completely and protected their territory violently. The sheriff's department had investigated for years, but nobody could ever prove anything. No bodies, no witnesses willing to testify. Nothing. Before I left, the deputy told me something I still think about all the time. He said, "Out here, getting lost ain't always the thing you should fear most." I have not driven remote mountain roads alone since that night, and every time I see fog rolling through the hills, I remember those flashlights moving silently between the trees. Still searching. My name is Claire Bennett, and 2 winters ago, I inherited a fire lookout tower deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee after my uncle died. Until then, I did not even know my family owned property there. I was living in Savannah at the time, working remote tech support and barely speaking to anyone in my family besides my mother. When the lawyer handling my uncle's estate called me, he sounded genuinely confused that the tower had been left to me specifically. According to him, my uncle had changed his will just 6 weeks before his death. The property sat somewhere near an abandoned logging settlement outside Elizabethton, accessible only by an old forestry road that was apparently closed during heavy snow. The lawyer strongly suggested selling it. Most folks around there avoid that mountain entirely, he told me. At the time, I assumed he meant because it was isolated. I know now that was not what he meant. The drive into the mountains took almost 9 hours. Once I left the highway, the roads became narrow and twisted through endless black pine forest. Every small town I passed looked frozen in time. Rusted gas pumps, collapsing churches, old men sitting silently outside convenience stores, watching traffic pass. The last gas station before the mountain was a tiny place called Mercer's Market. When I mentioned the name of the mountain to the cashier, her entire expression changed. "You headed up to Black Hollow Ridge?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She stared at me for several seconds before saying something I still think about constantly. "If you hear knocking after dark, don't answer it." Then she refused to say anything else. By the time I reached the forestry road, snow had already started falling. The lookout tower stood alone near the summit, rising above the trees on rusted steel supports. It looked abandoned at first glance, but when I climbed the stairs, I realized someone had maintained it recently. The lock had been replaced, the windows were clean, and there was fresh firewood stacked beside the door. Inside, the tower was small, but surprisingly warm. There was a cot, an old propane stove, shelves full of canned food, and dozens of notebooks stacked neatly beside a radio set that no longer worked. Most of the notebooks belonged to my uncle. At first, they seemed like ordinary journals about weather patterns and wildlife sightings. Then I found the entries about the sounds. According to my uncle, strange knocking noises echoed through the mountains almost every night after sunset. 3 knocks meant it was far away. 2 knocks meant it was moving closer. 1 knock meant you needed to turn off every light immediately and stay silent. I laughed when I first read that. My uncle had apparently spent decades alone in a mountain tower and slowly lost his mind. That night, around 1 a.m., I heard the first knock. It came from somewhere deep in the forest below the tower. A single heavy impact, like someone striking a tree with a giant hammer. About 30 seconds later, another knock answered from farther up the ridge. Then another. The sounds slowly circled the mountain. I remember standing by the window, trying to locate where they were coming from, when the radio beside the bed suddenly crackled to life. At first, it was only static. Then I heard a voice. "Turn off the light." The voice sounded exactly like my uncle. I froze. The radio crackled again. "Claire, turn off the light." That was when something moved between the trees below the tower. It was tall, far too tall to be human. I could only see pieces of it moving through the snowfall, but every time the moonlight hit it, I saw pale skin stretched tightly over impossibly long limbs. Then came another knock, this time directly beneath the tower. The entire structure vibrated. I shut off the lantern instantly. For the next hour, I listened to something circling below me in the darkness. Heavy footsteps in the snow, metal creaking beneath the tower, and every few minutes, another knock. Around dawn, the sounds finally stopped. I packed my things and left immediately. Halfway down the mountain, I noticed something carved into one of the trees beside the road. Tallies, hundreds of them, and beneath the marks, carved deeply into the bark, were 5 words. "It only comes to light." When I reached Mercer's Market again, I asked the cashier how long my uncle had lived on Black Hollow Ridge. She looked at me strangely. "Honey," she said quietly, "your uncle disappeared up there in 1998. According to the sheriff's department, nobody had seen him in almost 25 years. But somebody had been stacking fresh firewood beside that tower. And whatever was knocking in those mountains still knew my name. I had been walking for 6 hours when I found the cabin. No path leading to it. No signs. Just a structure sitting in the hollow between 2 ridges on Roan Mountain. Like it had always been there. Like it was waiting. I had one rule: never shelter in an abandoned building overnight. But the storm coming down the ridge gave me no choice. I went inside. The cabin was old, Maybe 100 years, maybe more. Pine walls dark with moisture, a single iron stove in the corner, 2 wooden chairs facing the window, a table with something carved into the surface. I couldn't make it out in the fading light. I dropped my pack, started a fire. That's when I noticed the door on the far wall, boarded up, not with old rotting wood, with fresh planks, recently nailed. Someone had been here, recently, and they had sealed that door like they meant it. I told myself it was just a storage room, a root cellar. I had no reason to open it. The storm hit hard around midnight, thunder rolling down the ridge like something enormous moving through the trees. I sat by the stove, half asleep. Then I heard it. Knocking, not from the front door, from behind the boarded wall. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. My chest tightened. I told myself it was wind, old wood expanding. I told myself a lot of things that night. Then the knocking stopped, and a voice came through, low, barely audible, like someone with their mouth pressed flat against the wood. Don't open it. I stood up, backed against the far wall, my hands shaking. Don't open it. They're watching. I wanted to speak. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely. The fire went out. Darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight. Found it. Clicked it on. The beam swept across the room. The 2 chairs by the window. They had moved. Both facing inward now. Facing the border door. Like someone had arranged them. Like someone was sitting in them. Waiting. Watching that door with me. I grabbed my pack. Moved to the front door. Pulled it open. Rain hit me like a wall. I ran. Didn't stop until I reached the main trail. Didn't look back. I reported it to the ranger station at Carver's Gap the next morning. The ranger listened. Didn't write anything down. Just looked at me for a long moment. Which hollow? He asked. I described the location, the 2 ridges, the iron stove. He nodded slowly. We know that cabin, he said. We've boarded that back door 4 times. He paused. Every time we come back, the boards are stacked neatly outside. No tools, no damage, just removed. He looked back at his desk, like the conversation was over. We don't send anyone up there past dark anymore. He didn't explain what was behind the door. I didn't ask. Some things in these mountains don't get explained. They just wait. If this gave you chills, subscribe, because the next story is worse.